Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to see you all here today. Thank you for joining me for a brown bag lunch, a virtual walk around Shockoe. We wanted to do this today with you because the city has recently released a draft small area plan for Shockoe. And this is the cover page of the plan, and I really love this cover page because it shows in orange the outline of the area of Richmond that the plan covers and calls Shockoe. And it's superimposed over the Mayo 1737 plan of Richmond. This was the first plan of Richmond, and it's the reason why our Richmond 300 master plan is called the Richmond 300, because it plans for the 300th anniversary of this area of Richmond. And this, the Mayo plan, as you can see, really is centered on Shockoe and shows that Shockoe is Richmond's oldest neighborhood. And we think it's important because it has the highest concentration of Richmond's most historic architectural fabric and historic resources, both above ground and below ground. You hear me say a lot that we care about people, places, and preservation. And those are all essential ingredients for success for a city and a community. And I love this picture of Shockoe because it shows people who care deeply about Richmond. This is Anna Edwards, who's giving a tour to Historic Richmond's Quoit Club from this spring. It shows the group on one of the many surface parking lots in Shockoe that we would like to see energized. This area would be the gateway to a new heritage campus in the vision of the plan. The heritage campus would include the Shockoe African Burial Ground just north of Broad Street on the other side of these railroad trestles, and the Devil's Half-Acre Lumpkins jail site on the other side of the trestles, just to the south of Broad Street. Anna is one of those people who has cared deeply about Shockoe and has advocated for decades for the Shockoe African Burial Ground. She can tell the story of the burial ground far better than I could ever attempt to do so. And so I encourage you to go on one of her tours. I'm not going to try to replicate her history. So please, I recommend those tours, or a tour of the slave trail, very essential. And the history of slave trading as a commercial activity is really was centered in Shockoe along 15th Street in this area. So it's really important. This plan has a great discussion of the history of Shockoe, which can help you understand Richmond's history. It's complicated history, it's tragic and difficult history at times, but it's really important for us to understand what was here. And it's important for us as people who care about places like Shockoe to advocate for them. So I hope you'll all weigh in on the Shockoe plan and think about that as I give you more of a virtual tour of Shockoe. Now, this is, again, the orange map. This is pulled, the orange boundaries of Shockoe from the draft plan. This is pulled from the draft plan, and I'm just including it here for orientation's sake. This area in blue is a 100-year floodway and 100-year floodplain. It really follows Shockoe Creek. Shockoe Creek was, while its boundaries moved a little bit over time, in the 1920s, it was buried by the city underground and channeled, but there's still flooding issues from this Shockoe Creek watershed that implicate this area. To the east is the core historic area and Main Street, where you'll see a lot of tobacco and commercial. And to the west of the highway over here is Shockoe Slip. And I'll talk about each of these areas individually. This is also a view from the draft plan. It's a great visualization. It shows the Heritage Campus over here. We're really excited for the Heritage Campus as a economic development catalyst for this area, as well as recognition, commemoration of this important aspect of Richmond's history. You can see the burial ground as open space north of Broad Street, and a museum envisioned for the site. The plan includes community engagement for planning around this museum. And then you can see that the plan, this visualization, also includes a lot of new development in this sort of beige color going up north of the valley, and then on some vacant parking lots along Main Street here and here to in the slip. You can look and study that more on your own time. The most significant resources in Shockoe date to the 1700s. There are very few historic resources in Richmond that date to the 1700s, and Shockoe has the largest concentration of them. Quickly, they're the Mayo Plan, the Shockoe African Burial Ground, the Old Stone House, now known as the Poe Museum, the Adam Craig House, the Old Hebrew Cemetery, and Mason's Hall. We'll look at them each more in slightly more detail. This is the Mayo Plan. It lays out a street grid block by block in squares. You can see that area superimposed on a modern Google map here, and you can see how this area of Shockoe still retains that historic street grid. That's really important, that historic street grid. That's probably the oldest surviving resource, above ground resource in the city. The Old Stone House from the 1750s, now the wonderful Poe Museum, is the oldest surviving structure in Shockoe. Now, you'll see on these slides, I say City Old and Historic District. That means that any exterior changes visible from the public right-of-way, including demolitions, are reviewed by the city's Commission of Architectural Review. This is a standalone City Old and Historic District, meaning it just covers this property, no others around it. The Adam Craig House is also in a City Old and Historic District. It dates from the late 1780s. It sits catty corner on the lot, which is a really unique surviving historic attribute, its placement on the parcel. It also includes very well preserved kitchen and slave quarters over here to the right. If you're interested, I hope you will listen to the webinar we held a couple of weeks ago on slave housing in Richmond. It really talks about how slave housing was prevalent and pervasive throughout Richmond's historic districts, and gives you a real window into that. This is Mason's Hall. Mason's Hall is the first purpose-built and the longest continuously occupied Masonic building in the country. Dates to 1785 to 7. It's in a City Old and Historic District, but like the Poe Museum, it's a standalone historic district. So the buildings on either side of it, all around it, are not covered by any protections and subject to no review. The burial ground we've already talked about. This is open space now. It was once a parking lot. We're glad to see it reclaimed from a parking lot, and we're excited to see it be a core element of the Heritage Campus. The Old Hebrew Cemetery is on Franklin Street. It is not within a City Old and Historic District, so there's theoretically no demo protections or protections on development on this site. This was the first recorded Jewish cemetery in the state of Virginia. It was lost to history in the early 1800s in that it was used as a coal yard and a junkyard for decades and close to a century. It was reconstructed and brought back to life and then restored again in the 1970s. Moving on from those oldest resources, we move on to the many diverse and different types of resources that are all within very close proximity in Shockoe. Shockoe has residential resources, commercial resources, industrial resources, civic resources, and railroad resources. And I'm going to take you through each of them, and then I'm going to take you over to Shockoe Slip. So I hope you will join me on sort of a speed round, moving around Shockoe. So the first, for residential resources, a lot of the residential development is centered around 19th Street and Gray Street. This is Gray Street. That's 19th Street up at that stop sign. These are two double houses, one very early, 1818 and 1845, both across from the Adam Craig House. This was originally a federal building. It has later Italianate roof details, and this is a Greek Revival structure. The Anson Richards House, just a block away as the crow flies, is not in a historic district. There are no demolition protections. It is a wonderful 1842 set of buildings that were recently adaptively rehabilitated into apartments. These buildings are just within a city old and historic district on 18th Street, just a stone's throw away from the Adam Craig House. This home was the home of Ash Levy, and that's the only known surviving residence of a slave trader within the slave trading district. These are very fine row called Elm Tree Row. This is just north of Broad Street. These date to the 1850s. There used to be residential development all around this. You can see that there's new development. That historic residential development, which was largely a Black community, was demolished in urban renewal in the 70s and 80s and is lost to the landscape. This is the Pace King House, which has a beautifully wrought cast iron porch veranda that was made in Richmond. Really cool. One of the most interesting things about the Pace King House, I think, is that it was owned and inhabited by a female entrepreneur in the late 1800s. She had an ice business, bringing ice to the hot and humid Richmond summer and helping with food preservation. So just across the street from the Pace King House is this really fine row of residential structures. There was a fire behind one of these structures in the not too distant past, which allowed them to be adaptively reused for a music recording studio. This is the In Your Ear studio space. So really interesting, awesome space for innovative, creative industry, and just beautiful. This is on 19th Street, again, sort of core part of the surviving residential area, his once residential area. So now we're moving on to commercial storefronts. There are a lot of really wonderful commercial storefronts in Shockoe, many concentrated on the Main Street area. There are no demo protections for most of these commercial storefronts. This is a really sweet commercial storefront from 1850, Greek Revival. What we're concerned about is many of these smaller structures being acquired and combined, and then all of them being demolished for larger scale development. And this commercial history is really important to Richmond. So further down on Main Street, this is a lovely series of 1870 facades, no demo protections on these, very fine original facade. This is the Belle Boisseaux building, which was a project that Historic Richmond was involved with rehabilitating with some long-term Shockoe developers in the 1870s. This is in a historic district, this block, that's the corner of it, right across from Mason's Hall on Franklin and 18th Street. These are some lovely Italianate buildings from the late 1800s on 17th Street, facing the farmers market, 17th Street Marketplace. Great backdrop for a really amazing civic space and awesome restaurants that I encourage you to patronize. No demo protections on those. No demo protections on these buildings either. We're back to Main Street. And when you walk down Main Street, you might be at street level, sidewalk level. You may not look up, but I encourage you to look up because there's some really amazing details. The brickwork on these structures is wonderful. No demolition protection. So these could be acquired and demolished without any community awareness or consultation or consideration of alternatives. There are also really interesting cast iron storefronts along a lot of on a lot of these structures. The ironwork would have been manufactured by Richmond-based ironworks or machine companies. This one on this structure was manufactured just a few blocks away on Carey Street. So we're moving on to civic resources, and I'm not showing you every building, but I am, for civic resources, showing you the only surviving civic resources. As residential development left Shockoe, the civic resources were lost. The places of worship were demolished and something else was produced in their place. The schools are gone, all disappeared from the landscape. These are interesting because you may not realize that Henrico County had 3 separate county courthouses over about 100 years on Main Street on this location in Shockoe. This was the latest one built in 1896. It's the only example of Romanesque revival architecture in the district. And then the sheriff's office next door built a couple years before in the colonial revival. These are adaptively reused. They're no longer the Henrico County offices. Another really important aspect of Shockoe is the history of Richmond's immigrant communities and Jewish community. We've touched on the Jewish community when we discussed earlier the Hebrew cemetery, but these two structures have a strong connection to both the Jewish community and immigrant communities. Temple Knesset Israel, this is on 19th Street, has been adaptively reused for apartments, but you can see the exterior survives. This is on 19th Street in a city old and historic district, and the city old and historic district's presence is probably the reason for the building's survival. And this is just 2 doors down. This is the Ladies Hebrew Benevolent Society, and it was instrumental in assisting Eastern European immigrants, Jewish immigrants, to resettle in Richmond. It's just a couple of blocks away from the train station, which would have been sort of the method of arrival for many of those people. So moving on, we have one other surviving place of worship. This building, originally built as Trinity Methodist Church, has been the New Light Baptist Church for close to 75 years. So again, that's it on civic structures. Trying to get to the next slide. Oh, sorry, 2 more civic structures. Firehouses. Last 2 firehouses surviving in Shockoe. The one on the right is Ironclad Coffee on 19th Street next to the residential area. It is wonderful. I encourage you to attend. A great adaptive reuse and a great local business. The one on the left is on Main Street. That is surrounded by new development. It was part of that redevelopment. They saved the firehouse. We're very grateful, but there's no city old and historic district here, so there were no protections for it. And the development, you can see here, 5 stories, 6 stories. You can see the scale of what that is against a 3-story firehouse, or against 2-story structures further down the street. And you can also see the impact of perhaps of not having a architectural review process on the new construction. So we're moving on to industrial architecture. This is the oldest surviving manufacturing building in the city, Whitlock's factory at the corner of 18th and Franklin. This is not in a city old and historic district. There are no demo protections for this, actually for the entire block. And we would really like to see a small expansion of the city old and historic district to include this block. It's really beautiful streetscapes, significant concentration of old fabric. Some of those commercial storefronts I showed you are on the farmers market down at this end of the block. There's also interior development along the alley, Walnut Alley, inside that block. Again, no demo protections, oldest surviving manufacturing building in the city. So you can't talk about manufacturing in Richmond without talking about the tobacco industry. There are a number of tobacco factories in Shockoe. They've made great adaptive reuse projects for apartments, and I think all of them now have been adaptively reused as residential structures. This is one that's typical of the 1850 type construction. There are 3 or 4 of these. There's no demo protection on this building. This is another one just down the street, same time period. I also encourage you to listen to our webinar that we did a couple of weeks ago on slave housing. You'll hear Elva Belch's talk about how people lived often on the factory floors at night. This is another one from about the same time period. This is just around the corner, and is also in a city old and historic district. You can see it juxtaposed against a tobacco factory from about 50 years later, further up the hill. This is another one. This parking lot right here has recently been rezoned and will likely be developed soon. These are slightly later. This one on the left is a tobacco factory. The one on the right actually was a different type of factory, but they're both excellent examples of really decorative brickwork that you see on some of these industrial buildings, the type of thing you would never see on an industrial building today. No city demolition protections on these, although there's a DHR easement on the tobacco factory. This is another tobacco factory with excellent, very fine decorative brickwork along Tobacco Road. This is the Holocaust Museum. I encourage you to go visit their Violins of Hope. There's no city demo protection on this, although there is a DHR easement on a number of those Tobacco Road properties. This is a different type of tobacco factory, a lower scale development, but also from about the same time period. So this is a little bit unique in the district, really interesting. No demo protections on this. Now we're moving into the 20th century tobacco factory development. This is an Art Deco architectural design. There are relatively few Art Deco buildings in Richmond, so this is really unique and really beautiful building. No demo protections. Again, some more Tobacco Row buildings with beautiful Art Deco on the bottom. No city demolition protections, although I mentioned there's a DHR easement on some of these. This is the American Tobacco Complex, a little bit further up the hill. This is within a city old and historic district, and it was recently adaptively reused. And so you can see a different type of tobacco warehouse here. You can see from all of these tobacco warehouses, particularly the later ones, that they have some significant scale Here are two really interesting ones along Carey Street. The one on the left here on this bottom view is 1717, which was recently adapted for a really awesome entrepreneurial incubator space. You can see the west-facing facade and the aerial view above. They won a Golden Hammer Award. We think this is an awesome project, creating factories of ideas where there were once factories for things like tobacco. So that's just awesome and a great addition to the neighborhood, and an excellent example of how these buildings can be adaptively reused for a number of different things. This is a cold storage complex north of Broad. There are no demo protections on this, although it was recently rehabilitated. And again, several more industrial commercial structures north of Broad, no demo protections on these either. Those were on Oliver Hill Way. The railroad has some really significant resources in Shockoe, and in many respects, the railroad story, Shockoe reflects the railroad story. It shaped the history and development of Shockoe in any number of ways. The head house, this just glorious head house, and then the train shed. And we've known and loved the head house for many years, but the recent rehabilitation of the train shed done by the city, there were people at the city who spent decades and decades working on this project, and we're just delighted to see its rehabilitation for Shockoe. It's enclosed by glass. Originally, it would have been open air, but this is, I think, one of the oldest and largest surviving steel truss train sheds in the country, and was an architectural engineering phenomena at the time it was constructed. And then Richmond, as everybody knows, Richmond has the only triple crossing in the country. This is one of many pictures of staged photographs of that triple crossing. The Seaboard Building is also part of the Main Street Station complex. It was originally a freight depot, lovely building. The Railroad YMCA, no demo protections here. It's housed wonderful restaurants and other businesses over the years. Very unique structure tied to the railroad activities in Shockoe. No demo protections. So I mentioned earlier the alleys. Walnut Alley, shown here on the left, is the best surviving example of that alley development. And I encourage you to walk through this alley and see how a number of the interior elements of the alley have been, are being adapted and rehabilitated today. In the 1800s, you would have seen a lot of tenements and other activity, an entire community that lived. Sometimes there were commercial operations within the alley structure. And that's one of the really important aspects of Shockoe's history that helps us to understand how our city developed and how it can continue to thrive today. You can also see the spall block paving on Crane Street over here on the left that you would have seen throughout Shockoe. So moving to Shockoe Slip, this is to the west of the highway. This area had more of an agricultural aspect to it. The commercial activities were focused on the agricultural industry, farmers and whatnot. Some of this is in a city old and historic district. There are a lot of surface parking lots, so there are development opportunities here. We hope to see a lot of this very fine architecture highlighted and more activity around it. These three buildings, to an untrained eye, might seem like they're early 20th century buildings, but they actually date to 1850, 1860 time period. Over here on the right, you see the Buffalo Wild Wings building. This is a 20th century louvered tobacco warehouse. A project has just been approved by the Commission of Architectural Review. This is within a city old and historic district, for adding 2 additional stories of residential development above that. So that shows that it's possible to add density to existing historic structures and we're interested to see how that turns out and how the public receives it. We were generally supportive of allowing additional density in that manner, as long as it's got an architectural review process and it's appropriate. So there's also some tobacco industry over in Shockoe Slip. This is the Philip Morris building, lovely Art Deco again. And this is across from the Buffalo Wild Wings, really fine brick structures. This is the buggy factory, again, tying back to that agricultural aspect of development. And this is the 1400 block of Carey Street, which has some great restaurants based. People think of this as an extension of Shockoe Slip, maybe more than as connected to Shockoe, the Shockoe Valley area, but very fine development dating to the 1870s and 80s. And then La Difference on 14th Street. This street wall of 14th Street has some very fine historic structures on it dating to the 1860s to the early 1900s, and has some massing and some density here. These are great adaptive reuses. So now that I've taken you on a tour of Shockoe, I wanted to let you know what we've been advocating for as part of this. We see this historic fabric as really important to save. It's the oldest part of the city. We've lost so much of it already. It provides great opportunities for small minority women-owned businesses, entrepreneurial activities, residential development, mixed-use development, and so we care deeply about this area. And as we see more attention focused on it, we also want to make sure that that historic fabric is protected and celebrated. And we see it as complementary to the Heritage Museum, Heritage Campus, the museum, and the open space, and as a catalyst for economic development. So because there's such a high concentration of historic fabric, very old buildings, we're asking for a demolition review ordinance, which would be tied to specific buildings. That's this area in the map on the left in cream colored. That was part of the Richmond 300, or that was recommended by the Richmond 300 and is recommended by the plan. So we are supportive of that and would like to see that happen sooner rather than later. We also are supporting the small extension of the City Old and Historic District with this boundary outlined in red. That would include Mason's Hall and the Poe Museum, the Whitlock Factory, some of the very oldest historic fabric. And the reason it's important to ask for all of these things is because the plan also has recommended heights for new buildings, with this cream colored area being recommended building heights of 2 to 5 stories. This is where most of the historic fabric is concentrated. We're supportive of that 5-story height. That would be B5. Most of it is already developed, already zoned as B5, which has 5-story height limits. We're supportive of this being zoned B5, this cream colored area. And then the purple areas, the plan is recommending for 12-story height limits, 2 to 12-story height limits. We think that we need some density in Shockoe, and we think this area going up the valley is appropriate for it. One of these parcels, the sand lot, is owned by the city and is earmarked for affordable housing. We think that's great. We support that as affordable housing. We'd like to see more affordable housing in this neighborhood. Most of it is market rate development. And we're generally supportive of the 2 to 12-story height limits in the purple areas. And then the green area is the Heritage Campus, and we're supportive of the Heritage Campus. We want the north of Broad, the burial ground, to be open space, but otherwise are supportive of the recommended building heights in that area. So if anyone has any questions about this or what we're advocating for, please feel free to let me know, and we hope you will weigh in on the plan yourself directly. There are a number of ways to do so. They're posted on the city website, and we'll include a link to that website so you can find those ways to weigh in. And we're just so grateful for you spending your time with us today for a brown bag lunch and a virtual tour of Shockoe, and hearing why this place is so important and why so many people who have ties to this area have come through this area, different elements of the Richmond community, the Jewish community, the immigrant community, the history of enslaved persons in this area, the indigenous communities. We really think this is important, and all aspects of our history tie back to Shockoe, and it's important to recognize that. So thank you for your time and have a great day. Bye-bye.